The box in the trunk. The late afternoon sun burned down on the narrow streets, casting long shadows that danced with the dust rising from Dian's worn sneakers. At 12 years old, Dian was wiry and small but sharp-eyed and quick. His sneakers were a testament to how tough things had been. The rubber was peeling from the soles, but they still held together, just like his family. He shifted a small bag of groceries over his shoulder, walking briskly toward home. The groceries were nothing fancy, just a few essentials: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and some sugar. The corner store clerk, Mr. Patel, had let him buy on credit again, even though Dian's mom hadn't paid off the last tab yet. It was one of those small acts of kindness that held the community together, even when times got rough. Dian lived on a block where every house told a story of struggle. Paint peeled off the walls, porches sagged under the weight of years, and the residents knew each other because they had no choice. Privacy wasn't an option when windows stayed open to let in air on hot days, and everyone's business spilled onto the street. "Hey, Dian," called Malik, a boy his age. Malik was kicking a flat soccer ball back and forth with another kid. His grin was infectious, but Dian couldn't find the energy to return it fully. "Coming to play later?" Malik shouted, flicking the ball into the air with surprising skill. "Maybe," Dian replied, adjusting the bag on his shoulder. "Got some stuff to do first." Malik shrugged and went back to his game. Dian turned toward his house, a small single-story home with cracks that ran along its walls like veins. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside as he pushed the door open, the hinge squealing in protest. Inside, his mom sat at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed as she stared down at a stack of bills and papers. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her face softened. "Hey, baby," she greeted, her voice tinged with weariness. "Hey, Ma." He set the bag of groceries down on the table. "Got what you asked for?" She sifted through the bag, her hands steady but slow. Flour, sugar, a few eggs. It wasn't much, but Dian knew it would stretch if she needed it to. "Thanks, baby," she murmured, half to herself. Her focus drifted back to the papers. Dian hesitated. "Landlord came by again, huh?" Her lips tightened, and she nodded. "Gave us another week," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After that, the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Dian felt his stomach twist, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say. He moved to the living room, where his younger brothers were sprawled on the floor, coloring on old sheets of paper. Dian knelt beside them, trying to distract himself from the weight pressing down on their family. "That's a nice dog," he said, pointing to a scribbled drawing of a lopsided hound. His youngest brother grinned, showing a gap where his front tooth had been. "That's Mr. Jenkins' dog," his brother declared proudly. Dian chuckled, though his mind was elsewhere. The stress etched on his mother's face was impossible to ignore, and he hated feeling so powerless. A knock at the door startled them all. "Dian," his mom called from the kitchen. "Get that, will you?" He pulled the door open just a crack, peeking out cautiously. It was Mr. Harov, their landlord. His neatly pressed shirt and polished shoes seemed out of place on their street, and his expression was tight, all business. "Your mom home?" he asked, peering past Dian into the small, cluttered living room. Dian nodded and stepped aside. His mom appeared moments later, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Harov," she greeted, her tone polite but guarded. "You know why I'm here," he replied, his voice clipped. "1 week, Miss Daniels. After that, I'll have no choice but to." "We'll figure it out," she cut in, her voice firm. "We just need a little more time." Mr. Harov frowned but didn't argue. He nodded once and turned, leaving without another word. The soft click of his car door closing seemed to echo in the silence. Dian's mom leaned against the door for a moment, closing her eyes. "Ma," Dian said quietly, "it's gonna be okay, right?" She opened her eyes and smiled at him. A tired, forced smile. "Yeah, baby," We'll figure it out. That evening, Dion tried to push everything to the back of his mind. He joined Malik and the other kids on the corner, kicking around the same deflated soccer ball they always used. The game was a welcome distraction, even if just for a little while. But as the sun dipped lower, something caught Dion's eye. A man struggling with a large wooden box on the side of the street. The man was old, his back bent under the weight of the box as he tried to drag it toward the open trunk of a black car. "Yo, hold up," Dion called to his friends, jogging toward the man without hesitation. "Need some help?" he asked, already grabbing one end of the box. The old man looked up, his face creased with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't think anyone would stop." Dion didn't respond, focusing instead on helping the man lift the box into the trunk. It was heavier than it looked, but they managed. "You're a good kid," the old man said, patting Dion's shoulder. "Not many like you left." Dion shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "It's nothing. You just looked like you needed a hand." The old man smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made Dion feel warm inside. He climbed into the car, and Dion watched as it drove away, its taillights disappearing down the street. Returning to his friends, Dion felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Something about the old man and that car felt different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. When Dion got home that night, his mom was asleep on the couch, a blanket draped haphazardly over her. The stack of bills and papers was still on the table. Dion tiptoed over, grabbed an old quilt from the closet, and gently tucked it around her. He lay awake in his room for hours, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind kept drifting back to the old man, the box, the black car. He had no idea that his small act of kindness was about to change everything. The unexpected visit. The next morning, Dion woke to the sound of his little brothers laughing and chasing each other through the house. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the curtains, highlighting the faded wallpaper and the worn-out carpet. For a brief moment, things felt normal, almost carefree. But as Dion got up and stretched, the weight of the previous day's events settled back on his shoulders. His mom was already up, standing at the stove and stirring a pot of oatmeal. The scent of cinnamon filled the small kitchen, and Dion's stomach rumbled. "Morning, Ma," he greeted, sliding into a chair at the table. "Morning, baby," she replied, turning to give him a quick smile. She seemed lighter today, as though the night's sleep had eased some of her burden. "You sleep okay?" "Yeah, I guess," Dion lied. He hadn't told her about the old man and the black car. Not yet. It wasn't that he wanted to keep secrets, but something about the whole situation felt complicated. As they ate, his mom's phone buzzed on the counter. She checked the screen, her brow furrowing. "Landlord again," Dion guessed, spooning oatmeal into his mouth. His mom shook her head. "No, just a reminder about the clinic appointment later." She paused, then looked at Dion. "You think you can keep an eye on your brothers while I'm gone?" "Of course, Ma," he said without hesitation. His mom nodded, her expression softening. "Thanks, baby. You're a good kid." Dion shrugged, focusing on his oatmeal. He wasn't so sure about that. Later that afternoon, Dion sat on the front steps, watching his brothers play in the yard. They were chasing a soccer ball, taking turns pretending to be goalkeepers. Dion smiled faintly at their antics, but his thoughts kept drifting. He was just about to go back inside when a sleek black car turned the corner and began rolling slowly down the street. Dion froze, his pulse quickening. It was the same car from yesterday, the one the old man had driven. The car came to a stop directly in front of their house. Dion's mouth went dry as the driver's door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He looked polished and out of place, like he belonged in a bank or a boardroom, not on their block. "Yo, Dion, you know that guy?" Malik's voice called from across the street. Dion shook his head, barely able to speak. I don't think so." The man spotted Dion immediately and approached with purposeful strides. Dian's instincts told him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. "Dian Daniels?" the man asked, stopping a few feet away. Dian swallowed hard. "Yeah, that's me." The man's expression softened. "My name is Mr. Hargrave. My father mentioned you, said you helped him yesterday with a heavy box." Dian nodded slowly, his stomach twisting. "Yeah, I remember." Mr. Hargrave glanced toward the house, where Dian's mom was now standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Your mother, I presume?" he asked, inclining his head respectfully. "Yeah," Dian said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hargrave smiled faintly. "My father wanted me to come by and personally thank you for your kindness. He doesn't forget gestures like that." Dian glanced back at his mom, who was now making her way down the steps. Her posture was stiff, her eyes wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone firm but polite. Mr. Hargrave extended a hand. "Miss Daniels, I'm Mr. Hargrave. My father was deeply moved by your son's actions yesterday. He's asked to meet Dian again, to thank him in person." Dian's mom didn't take his hand. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. Why would he want to do that? Dian just helped him with a box. That's all. "True," Mr. Hargrave said, dropping his hand. "But my father values kindness. He insists on expressing his gratitude properly." Dian could feel the tension radiating from his mom. "We're not interested," she said finally. "Ma," Dian started, but she shot him a look that silenced him. Mr. Hargrave hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "Here's my contact information. I understand your hesitation, but if you change your mind, please let me know. My father isn't well, and this means a great deal to him." Dian's mom stared at the card for a long moment before taking it reluctantly. She didn't say anything, and Mr. Hargrave nodded, taking the hint. "Thank you for your time," he said, turning to leave. Dian watched as he climbed back into the car and drove away, his heart pounding in his chest. His mom stood frozen on the porch, her fingers gripping the card tightly. "What did you do?" she finally asked, her voice low. "Nothing, Ma," Dian said quickly. "I just helped him with a box, that's all." Her eyes searched his face, and he could see the worry etched into her features. "We don't know these people, Dian. They could be trouble." "They're not," Dian insisted, though he wasn't entirely sure. His mom sighed heavily and looked down at the card in her hand. "I don't like this," she muttered. "But if it's really just to say thank you." Dian's stomach churned. He didn't know what to think, but part of him was curious. Curious enough that he didn't argue when she slipped the card into her pocket. That night, Dian couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events in his mind. Something about Mr. Hargrave's visit felt off. Not threatening exactly, but strange. The next morning, the decision was made for them. Another black car pulled up outside their house, but this time, it wasn't Mr. Hargrave. It was someone else. A younger man in a crisp uniform who introduced himself as James. "My employer asked me to bring you to him," James explained politely. Dian's mom hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It'll be quick," James added, sensing her hesitation. "He just wants to thank your son properly. Nothing more." Dian glanced at his mom. Her face was unreadable, but after a long pause she nodded. "All right," she said, "but I'm coming too." Dian's heart raced as they climbed into the car. The drive was quiet, the city streets giving way to neighborhoods he'd never seen before. Big houses with manicured lawns and high fences. It was like another world, one far removed from the cracked sidewalks and peeling paint of his own block. When they finally arrived, Dian's breath caught in his throat. The house was enormous, a sprawling white mansion surrounded by towering trees. James led them inside, and Dian felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. The floors were polished to a gleaming shine, and every piece of furniture looked expensive and delicate. "My father is waiting in the sitting room," James said, gesturing toward a door at the end of a long hallway. Dion glanced at his mom, who gave him a small nod. Together, they stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. An unforeseen offer. Dion and his mom stepped into the sitting room, the polished wooden floors reflecting the soft glow of sunlight streaming through high arched windows. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral, like fresh-cut roses. It was larger than their entire house, with high ceilings and walls lined with bookshelves. Expensive-looking artwork hung in gilded frames, and the furniture was arranged in a way that looked both inviting and intimidating. In the center of it all, seated in a high-backed armchair near the window, was the old man Dion had helped. He looked frailer than before, his skin pale, and his white hair thin and wispy, but his eyes lit up when he saw Dion. "There's the young man I've been waiting for," the old man said, his voice soft but warm. He waved a trembling hand, gesturing for Dion to come closer. "Come, come. Let me get a good look at you." Dion hesitated, glancing at his mom. She gave him a subtle nod, her eyes still cautious but softening just a little. Dion stepped forward, his sneakers squeaking slightly against the shiny floor. "Hello, sir," Dion said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. The old man smiled, his face crinkling with lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Ah, so polite. Please, call me Mr. Hargrave. Sit, sit." He gestured to a plush chair across from him. Dion sat gingerly, feeling the chair sink under his weight. His mom stayed standing, her arms crossed as she hovered protectively nearby. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did," Mr. Hargrave continued, his gaze fixed on Dion. "You saw an old man struggling and stepped in to help without hesitation. That kind of kindness, it's rare these days." "It was nothing," Dion mumbled, shifting uncomfortably. "I just saw you needed help." "Precisely," Mr. Hargrave said, leaning forward slightly. "You acted when others might not have. That's what makes you special." Dion wasn't sure how to respond, so he stayed silent. The old man nodded to someone standing in the corner of the room. A younger man dressed in the same uniform as the driver. The man stepped forward, carrying a polished wooden box. "Dion," Mr. Hargrave said, his voice serious now. "I know you didn't help me expecting anything in return. That's what makes your gesture so meaningful. But I'm not one to overlook a good deed. I want you to have this." The box was placed on the table between them, and the man opened it with a quiet click. Dion's eyes widened. Inside were neat stacks of cash, more money than he had ever seen in his life. His mom gasped softly behind him, her hand flying to her mouth. I can't take this," Dion stammered, his heart racing. "I didn't do it for money." "I know," Mr. Hargrave said, his tone gentle. "And that's exactly why I want you to have it. Consider it a gift, a token of my gratitude. Use it to help your family, to ease the burdens you carry. You deserve it." Dion looked at his mom. Her face was a mix of shock and hesitation. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Dion's shoulder. "Mr. Hargrave," she began, her voice steady but cautious. "This is more than generous. But we're not used to this kind of kindness. Why us? Why my son?" The old man's smile softened, and for a moment he looked almost wistful. "Because I've been where you are," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the world is stacked against you. When I was young, someone helped me when they didn't have to. It changed my life. I've been looking for a way to pay that kindness forward ever since. Your son gave me that chance." Dion's mom was silent, her grip on his shoulder tightening slightly. Dion swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the old man and the box of money. "Ma," Dion said softly, his voice uncertain. He wanted her to decide because the weight of it all felt too heavy for him to bear alone. She let out a long breath, then looked at Mr. Hargrave. "This money, it would help us. A lot. But I don't want my son thinking the world owes him something just for doing the right thing. Mr. Hargrave nodded, his expression serious. A wise perspective. And you're right. The world doesn't always reward kindness, but sometimes it does. Let this be one of those times. After a long pause, Dion's mom finally nodded. All right, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thank you, Mr. Hargrave. This means more than I can say. Dion reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the box. He lifted it carefully, the weight of it feeling heavier than he expected, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. Responsibility. Hope. A chance. The ride back home was quiet. Dion held the box on his lap, his mind racing. His mom stared out the window, her expression unreadable. When they finally pulled up to their house, the black car idled for a moment before driving away, leaving them standing on the sidewalk with the box between them. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Dion's mom placed the box on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before turning to Dion. You understand what this means, don't you? She asked, her voice low. Dion nodded. Yeah, Ma. I think so. This isn't just money, she continued, her eyes locking onto his. This is a chance. Chance to make things better for all of us. But it's also a responsibility. You can't take something like this lightly. I won't, Dion promised. And he meant it. That night, Dion lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The box was still on the kitchen table, untouched. He could hear his mom moving around the house, checking on his little brothers, locking the doors. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something else too. Hope. As he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Hargrave's gesture might mean for their future. Would it really change things, or would it bring more complications than they were ready for? Only time would tell. Ripples of change. The following morning, the box of money was still sitting in the center of the kitchen table like a question waiting to be answered. Dion's mom hadn't touched it, and neither had he. It felt too significant, too heavy, not in its weight, but in what it represented. Dion shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy from a restless night. His mom was already up, sipping a cup of instant coffee and staring out the window, her expression distant. His little brothers were still asleep, their soft snores drifting from the room they shared. Morning, Ma, Dion said, sliding into a chair at the table. His eyes flicked to the box, then back to her. What are we gonna do? His mom sighed, setting her mug down and turning to face him. She looked tired, the kind of tired that went beyond lack of sleep. First, I'm paying the landlord, she said firmly. That's the only way we can breathe easy for a little while. After that, she trailed off, her gaze returning to the window. After that, we need to be smart about this, she continued. This money could help us, but it could also bring problems. People talk, Dion. They see us suddenly paying off bills and buying new things, and they'll start asking questions. Questions we don't want to answer. Dion nodded, understanding what she meant. Their neighborhood wasn't a place where wealth went unnoticed or unchallenged. People struggled every day, and jealousy could turn even friends into strangers. I'll be careful, Ma, he said quietly. I promise. By mid-morning, Dion's mom was gone, having taken a portion of the money to pay the landlord. She'd also planned to settle some of their smaller debts at the corner store and with a few neighbors who had helped them out over the years. Dion stayed home, keeping an eye on his brothers as they played in the yard. The day was bright but cool, a welcome break from the usual heat. Dion sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched them chase each other around. Yo, Dion. He looked up to see Malik jogging toward him from across the street, his usual wide grin plastered on his face. Malik stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Dion with a mix of curiosity and excitement. Man, what's going on with you? Malik asked, gesturing toward the house. People are talking. Said some fancy guy came by in a black car yesterday. What's that about? Dion hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to spill everything. The last thing he needed was for the whole neighborhood to start prying into their business. It's nothing, Dion said with a shrug, trying to sound casual. Just someone my mom knows. They came by to talk about some stuff. Malik raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. Stuff? Like what? Simon, man, you can tell me. Dion shook his head, forcing a laugh. It's nothing really. Just boring grown-up stuff. Malik looked disappointed, but didn't push further. All right, but if you're keeping secrets, I'm gonna find out eventually. Dion rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. You do that. That evening, his mom returned with a noticeable lightness in her step. She placed a few grocery bags on the counter and began unpacking them. Fresh vegetables, a carton of orange juice, and even a small package of chicken. It was more than they'd had in weeks. How'd it go, Ma? Dion asked as he helped put the groceries away. She smiled, her first real smile in days. The landlord's off our backs for now, and Mr. Patel of the corner store is squared away too. It feels good to not owe anyone anything for a change. Dion nodded, relief washing over him. For the first time, it felt like they were standing on solid ground. But his mom's smile faded as she leaned against the counter, her expression growing serious. We still have to be careful, she said. This doesn't mean everything's fixed. It's just a start. Dion understood. The money might have bought them some breathing room, but it couldn't erase all their problems. The next day, Dion decided to visit Mr. Patel's corner store to pick up a few things his mom had forgotten. As he stepped outside, he noticed the subtle shift in the neighborhood. People were watching him, more than usual. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman from across the street, gave him a lingering look as she swept her porch. A group of kids playing near the corner paused their game to whisper among themselves as he walked by. Even Mr. Jenkins, who was usually too busy tinkering with his ancient truck to notice much, gave Dion a nod that felt heavier than a simple greeting. Dion kept his head down, his hands shoved into his pockets. He could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing down on him. When he reached the store, Mr. Patel greeted him warmly. Dion, how's your mama? She's good, Mr. Patel, Dion said, grabbing a loaf of bread and a can of beans. Thanks for helping her out before. Mr. Patel waved a hand dismissively. Your family's good people. It's what neighbors do. As Dion paid, he couldn't shake the feeling that even Mr. Patel was studying him a little closer than usual. He left the store quickly, eager to get back home. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. Neighbors stopped Dion on the street to ask seemingly innocent questions about his family's sudden good fortune. Even Malik, who had always been Dion's closest friend, seemed unable to resist probing. You've been acting weird, Malik said one afternoon as they kicked around the same deflated soccer ball they always used. Something's up, and you're not telling me. It's nothing, Dion insisted, focusing on the ball. Is it that guy in the suit? Malik pressed. What did he give you? Money? A job? Something else? Dion stopped the ball with his foot and looked at Malik, his expression serious. Malik, drop it. It's none of your business. Malik held up his hands, backing off. Fine, fine. I was just asking. That night, Dion's mom sat him down at the kitchen table after his brothers had gone to bed. The box of money was still there, though it had been carefully sorted and accounted for. We need to talk, she said, her tone serious. Dion's stomach tightened. What's wrong? It's the neighbors, she said. People are starting to notice. They're asking questions I don't have answers for. Dion nodded slowly. He'd felt it too. The shift, the way everyone seemed to be watching them now. We can't let this change who we are, his mom continued. This money, it's a blessing, but it's also a test. We have to use it wisely, and we have to stay humble. You hear me? I hear you, Ma, Dion said softly. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're a good kid, Dian. Don't let this make you forget that." Dian nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew she was right. The money might have eased some of their struggles, but it had also brought new challenges. And as much as he wanted to believe that everything would be okay, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, the shadow of suspicion. The days that followed were a strange mix of hope and unease for Dian and his family. With the landlord paid, groceries in the fridge, and bills settled, it seemed like life had taken a sharp turn for the better. But in the quiet corners of their neighborhood, whispers grew louder, casting long shadows over their newfound stability. Dian sat on the porch steps one cool afternoon, watching his little brothers play tag in the yard. Their laughter carried on the breeze, a rare sound that made the weight on his chest feel a little lighter. For once, they weren't worried about what tomorrow might bring. His mom had started humming again while she cooked, and there was enough food for second helpings at dinner. It was almost like they were normal. Almost. "Dian." Malik's voice called out, breaking the calm. Dian looked up to see his friend sauntering down the sidewalk, his hand shoved into his hoodie pockets. Malik's grin was wide, but there was something in his eyes, a curiosity that hadn't faded since the black car first appeared in their neighborhood. "What's up, man?" Dian asked, trying to sound casual as Malik plopped down beside him on the steps. "Not much," Malik said, but his tone betrayed him. He glanced over at Dian, then toward the house. "You've been quiet lately. Everyone's talking, you know." Dian groaned inwardly, knowing exactly where this was going. "Talking about what?" "You," Malik said bluntly. "You and that black car. And your mom paying off the landlord. People are saying you guys hit the lottery or something." Dian chuckled dryly. "If we did, we wouldn't still be here, would we?" Malik shrugged, leaning back on his elbows. "So what's the deal then? You can tell me. I won't say nothing." Dian hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the step. He didn't want to lie to Malik, but the truth felt too big, too complicated to explain. "It's just, my mom knew someone who helped us out, that's all. It's nothing big." Malik's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push further. "All right, if you say so. But you know how people are around here. They'll keep talking until they figure it out." Dian nodded, his stomach twisting. He didn't need Malik to tell him that. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors every time he stepped outside. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Dian's mom sat him down at the kitchen table. The box of money was no longer sitting there. It had been moved to a safer spot, hidden away from prying eyes. Still, its presence lingered like a ghost in their small home. "Dian," his mom began, her voice steady but serious. "We need to talk." He nodded, leaning forward slightly. "What's up?" "It's about the Hargraves," she said, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "Something about all this doesn't sit right with me." Dian frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her gaze dropping to the table. "They've been kind, and I'm grateful for what they've done. But people like that, they don't just give away money without expecting something in return. I can't help but wonder if there's more to this than they're letting on." Dian shifted uncomfortably. "You think they want something from us?" "Maybe," she said, her voice low. "Or maybe they're just being kind. But we can't afford to take chances, Dian. We have to be careful." He nodded slowly, understanding her concern. The Hargraves had seemed genuine, but his mom was right. People with that much money didn't usually cross paths with families like theirs without a reason. The following day, Dian tried to go about his usual routine. He ran errands for his mom, played with his brothers, and tried to ignore the stares and whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But by mid-afternoon, the unease in his chest had grown too heavy to ignore. It was Malik who finally broke through his thoughts. "Yo, Dian, you coming to the park, or what?" Dian blinked, realizing he'd been staring off into space. "Oh yeah, sure. They headed to the park, where a group of kids was already kicking around a battered soccer ball. For a while, Dion managed to lose himself in the game, the familiar rhythm of running and passing easing the tension in his chest. But as the sun began to set, he spotted something that made his stomach drop. A black car, parked at the edge of the park, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. "Yo, Dion," Malik said, nudging him. "Ain't that the same car?" Dion's throat tightened as he nodded. "Yeah, looks like it." The car didn't move, didn't even so much as rev its engine, but its presence was enough to send a chill down Dion's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. That night, Dion couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of cars passing on the main road. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why was the car at the park? Was it a coincidence, or were the Hargraves keeping tabs on him? In the early hours of the morning, he finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by the sound of a knock at the door. His heart pounded as he sat up, his ears straining to catch the sound again. "Dion," his mom called from the hallway. "You awake?" "Yeah, Ma," he said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "What's going on?" "Someone's at the door," she said, her voice tight. "I want you to stay back." Dion hesitated, then followed her into the living room. She approached the door cautiously, peeking through the curtain before opening it a crack. Standing on the porch was James, the driver from the Hargrave household. He looked as polished as ever, his expression calm but unreadable. "Miss Daniels," James said politely, "I apologize for the hour, but my employer has asked to see you and Dion again. It's urgent." Dion's mom stiffened. "Why? What's this about?" "I'm afraid I can't say," James replied. But Mr. Hargrave insisted it was important. Dion's stomach twisted as he stepped closer. "Ma, maybe we should go, just to see what he wants." His mom turned to him, her expression conflicted. She didn't like this. He could see it in her eyes. But after a long moment, she sighed and nodded. "All right," she said. "But I'm coming too." James nodded, stepping aside to let them pass. As they climbed into the car, Dion couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was going to change everything. The truth unveiled. The car ride to the Hargrave estate felt heavier this time. Dion sat beside his mom in the backseat, the polished leather cold against his hands. His mom's fingers were tight around her bag, her jaw set in a hard line as she stared straight ahead. James, the driver, said nothing, his stoic demeanor adding to the tension. Dion tried to focus on the passing scenery, rows of towering trees, immaculate lawns, and houses that looked more like palaces. It was a world so far removed from his own that it felt almost surreal. But his thoughts kept circling back to the question he couldn't shake. Why had Mr. Hargrave summoned them again? The car turned down the long driveway leading to the estate, the same one they had visited before. Dion's chest tightened as the sprawling white mansion came into view, its grandeur almost mocking in its perfection. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the grand entrance. James stepped out first, opening the door for them. "This way, please," he said, his voice calm but firm. Dion's mom hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the mansion. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped out, Dion following close behind. They were led through the same ornate hallway as before, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. But this time, they were taken to a different room, a private study with walls lined with bookshelves and a massive oak desk at its center. Behind the desk sat Mr. Hargrave, his frail figure dwarfed by the grand chair. Despite his physical weakness, his presence filled the room. His eyes lit up when he saw Dion and his mom. "Ah, there you are," Mr. Hargrave said, his voice warmer than Dion expected. He gestured to the chairs in front of the desk. "Please, sit." Dion and his mom exchanged a glance before taking their seats. James remained by the door, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Hargrave began, folding his hands on the desk. "I know this must feel unusual, and I apologize for any unease my requests have caused. Dion's mom leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. With all due respect, Mr. Hargrave, unusual doesn't begin to cover it. You've been generous, but we can't help wondering. Why? Mr. Hargrave nodded, his expression thoughtful. A fair question, and one I intend to answer. He paused, his gaze shifting to Dion. But first, Dion, I need to ask you something. Do you remember the box you helped me with? Dion blinked, surprised by the question. Yeah. It was heavy, but I didn't think much about it at the time. Why? Mr. Hargrave's lips curved into a faint smile. That box contained something very important to me. Documents, records, and memories. You see, I've been organizing my affairs, knowing that my time is limited. Limited? Dion asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded. I'm dying, Dion. The doctors say I have months left, maybe less, and as my time draws near, I find myself reflecting on the choices I've made, the people I've helped, and those I've failed. Dion's mom shifted in her seat, her posture softening. I'm sorry to hear that, she said quietly, but I still don't understand what this has to do with us. Mr. Hargrave's gaze turned serious. It has everything to do with you. When Dion helped me that day, he reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. What it means to give without expecting anything in return. It's a lesson I learned a long time ago, but one I fear I haven't always lived by. Dion furrowed his brow, confused. I don't get it. What are you saying? Mr. Hargrave leaned back in his chair, his frail hands resting on the armrests. Many years ago, I was in a situation not unlike your family's. My mother and I struggled to make ends meet. We lived in a small house, barely scraping by. One day, a stranger extended a hand of kindness, giving us the means to survive. That gesture changed the course of my life. Dion's mom tilted her head, her expression skeptical. And you're saying you're trying to repay that kindness now? By helping us? Precisely, Mr. Hargrave said, his tone earnest. You see, I built a fortune over the years, but I've often wondered if I've done enough to honor the gift I was given. Helping your family feels like a step toward making peace with that. Dion's mom frowned, her hands tightening in her lap. I appreciate your intentions, but this is a lot to process. It's not easy accepting help like this, especially when it feels like there's a catch. There is no catch, Mr. Hargrave assured her. All I ask is that you use what I've given you to better your lives, and if possible, to pass that kindness forward when the time comes. Dion swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never considered that his small act of helping with a box could lead to something so profound. But a part of him couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. Why now? Dion asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Why not help more people earlier? Why us? Mr. Hargrave's expression turned somber. I've asked myself that many times. I suppose I let the distractions of wealth and business cloud my priorities. I won't make excuses for it. But now, with the end in sight, I want to make amends in the ways I can. Dion's mom seemed to relax slightly, her guarded posture softening. We don't want to seem ungrateful, she said. This has already changed so much for us. But we're still cautious. People like us have to be. Mr. Hargrave nodded, his eyes kind. And that's wise. I wouldn't expect anything less. As they left the estate later that evening, the air felt lighter somehow. Dion and his mom walked down the driveway toward the waiting car, the weight of the conversation settling into their bones. In the car, Dion finally broke the silence. Meh, do you believe him? About why he's helping us? She looked out the window, her expression thoughtful. I don't know, baby. But I do believe he's trying to make things right, in his own way. That doesn't mean we can let our guard down, though. Dion nodded, understanding. The Hargraves' generosity might have been genuine, but it didn't erase the challenges they would still face. If anything, it made them more determined to rise above their circumstances, not just for themselves, but for the people who had supported them along the way. As the car pulled up to their house, Dion felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his mom by his side and the lesson of the Hargraves in his heart, he knew they could face whatever came next. A new beginning. The black car pulled away, its smooth hum fading into the night. Dion and his mom stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of their house, the cool evening air carrying the faint scent of rain. The sky above them was a patchwork of stars and low-hanging clouds. For a moment, they just stood there, silent, the weight of the day settling into their bones. "Let's go inside," his mom finally said, her voice quiet but firm. She led the way up the steps, the familiar creak of the porch boards grounding Dion as he followed. Once inside, the door shut with a finality that made the small house feel safe, like a shield against the uncertainties of the world. His mom placed her bag on the counter and turned to him. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Dion obeyed, pulling out a chair and sitting down. His mom joined him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. "Deciding the path forward." The kitchen felt too small for the gravity of the conversation that followed. Dion listened as his mom laid out their options, her voice steady but laced with caution. The Hargraves' gift had given them a lifeline, but it wasn't infinite. If they weren't careful, the money could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. "We start small," his mom said. "Pay off the bills, get caught up on rent, and maybe fix a few things around the house. Nothing flashy, nothing that draws attention." Dion nodded, his mind racing. He could picture the peeling paint on the walls, the sagging porch, the leaky faucet in the bathroom. There were so many things that needed fixing, so many ways they could make life better. "And you," his mom continued, her eyes locking onto his, "are going to stay in school. No skipping, no slacking. This money isn't an excuse to stop working hard. It's a chance to do better." "Yes, ma'am," Dion said, his voice firm. He meant it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real shot at something. A chance to rise above the circumstances that had weighed his family down for so long. Whispers in the neighborhood. The next morning, Dion woke early. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the cracked ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house waking up. His brothers giggling as they got ready for school, his mom humming softly in the kitchen. It was a new day, but the challenges they faced were still very real. When he finally stepped outside, he felt the eyes on him immediately. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and over fences, their gazes sharp with curiosity and suspicion. Dion forced himself to keep walking, his head held high. "Yo, Dion." Malik's voice cut through the tension like a lifeline. Dion turned to see his friend jogging toward him, his usual wide grin tempered by something more serious. Malik fell into step beside him, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. "Man, everyone's talking," Malik said, his tone quieter than usual. "They're saying your mom paid off the landlord, got new groceries, and might even fix up the house. What's going on?" Dion hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He wanted to tell Malik everything, to share the strange, almost surreal experience of meeting the Hargraves and receiving their gift. But he knew the risks. The more people knew, the more complicated things could get. "It's nothing," Dion said finally. "Just someone helping us out. That's all." Malik gave him a sidelong glance but didn't press further. "Well, whatever it is, you're lucky. Just be careful. Man, people around here, they don't always take kindly to sudden changes." Dion nodded, understanding all too well what Malik meant. In their neighborhood, wealth was rare and jealousy could be dangerous. Unexpected opportunities. Later that week, Dion's mom used part of the money to hire Mr. Jenkins, their neighbor, to fix the leaky roof. It wasn't a big job, but it was enough to make a noticeable difference. When the rain came a few days later, the steady drip that had plagued their kitchen was gone. Word spread quickly, and soon other neighbors started showing up, offering to help with small repairs in exchange for modest payments. Diane's mom accepted their offers, knowing that keeping the work local would not only improve their home, but also build goodwill in the community. Diane watched as the repairs transformed their house little by little. The sagging porch was reinforced, the peeling paint was replaced with a fresh coat, and the leaky faucet in the bathroom was finally fixed. It wasn't flashy, but it was enough to make the house feel like a home again. Paying it forward. One afternoon, Diane and his mom sat on the porch, watching his brothers play in the yard. The repairs were nearly complete, and the house felt like a symbol of hope, a testament to what kindness could accomplish. His mom turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Diane," she said, "we need to find a way to give back." Diane blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean we've been blessed," she said, "and it's our responsibility to share that blessing with others. Maybe not with money. We don't have much left. But with our time, our effort, something." Diane nodded slowly, the idea settling into his mind. He thought about the Hargraves, about how a single act of kindness had set off a chain reaction that had changed their lives. Maybe they could do the same for someone else. A ripple effect. Diane and his mom started small. They volunteered at the community center, helping with food drives and after-school programs. Diane found himself mentoring younger kids, teaching them how to play soccer and helping them with their homework. His mom organized a clothing drive, collecting donations from neighbors and distributing them to families in need. The changes didn't go unnoticed. The whispers in the neighborhood began to shift, from suspicion to admiration. People started to see Diane and his family not as recipients of luck, but as contributors to the community's well-being. A visit from the past. Months passed, and life began to feel steady again. One day, as Diane was returning home from school, a familiar black car pulled up to the curb. His heart skipped a beat as he watched Mr. Hargrave step out, leaning heavily on a cane. James was by his side, steadying him. "Diane," Mr. Hargrave said, his voice weaker but still warm. "May I have a word?" Diane nodded, leading the older man to the porch. His mom appeared moments later, her expression cautious but kind. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," Mr. Hargrave said as he sat down, his gaze sweeping over the freshly painted house and the lively yard. "It seems you've made good use of the gift." "We have," Diane's mom said. "And we're grateful. More than you know." Mr. Hargrave smiled faintly. "That's good to hear. But I can see you've done more than just help yourselves. You've helped others too. That's all I could have hoped for." Diane felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized until that moment how much the Hargraves' kindness had shaped his life, not just in practical ways, but in the way he viewed the world. "Thank you," Diane said quietly, "for everything." Mr. Hargrave nodded, his eyes shimmering with something that looked like pride. "No, Diane. Thank you." The legacy of kindness. As the black car drove away, Diane stood on the porch, watching until it disappeared around the corner. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. The ripples of kindness had changed his life. And now, it was his turn to create ripples of his own, planting seeds of the future. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. But it wasn't. For Diane and his family, normal had always meant struggle, constant uncertainty, and the weight of survival pressing on their shoulders. Now their lives carried a different kind of weight. The responsibility to make their newfound stability meaningful and lasting. Diane walked to school with a confidence he hadn't felt before. His old sneakers, once held together by tape and determination, had been replaced with a sturdy new pair his mom had insisted he buy. At first, he felt self-conscious about them, worried that his classmates might notice the change and start asking questions. But to his surprise, nobody did. Instead, people seemed to treat him with a quiet respect he hadn't known he needed. The whispers in the neighborhood had quieted too. Repairs to their house had stopped drawing attention, and his mom's active involvement in community projects had given people a reason to trust their intentions. The Daniels family wasn't seen as an anomaly anymore. They were seen as part of the heartbeat of the neighborhood, a growing circle. One crisp Saturday morning, Dion's mom called him into the kitchen. She was flipping through a pile of mail, her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. "We got this," she said, handing Dion an envelope. The return address was for a local youth mentorship program. Dion opened it and skimmed the letter. His eyes widened. "They want me to speak at their event." His mom smiled faintly, her hands resting on the table. "They've seen the work you've been doing with the younger kids at the community center. I guess you made an impression." Dion hesitated, the weight of the invitation settling on him. He had been helping out at the center almost every day after school, coaching soccer, tutoring kids who struggled with homework, and just being a big brother to those who didn't have one. It had started as a way to give back, but it had quickly become one of the best parts of his life. "You should do it," his mom said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've got something to say, Dion, and people will listen." Dion nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll do it." The event. The youth mentorship event was held at a community hall on the other side of town. It was bigger and fancier than anything Dion had expected. Rows of chairs filled the room, and a small stage stood at the front, framed by curtains and bright lights. Dion's nerves churned as he waited backstage, clutching the small note card he'd written his speech on. "Next up, we have a young man who has made an incredible impact in his community," the host announced. "Please welcome Dion Daniels." The applause was louder than he anticipated, and as he stepped onto the stage, his heart thudded in his chest. He scanned the audience, spotting his mom and brothers near the front. Their smiles steadied him. "Hi," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Hi, my name is Dion Daniels, and I want to tell you a story." He spoke about his neighborhood, his family, and the challenges they have faced. He talked about the day he helped an old man with a heavy box and how that small act had changed everything. But most importantly, he talked about what he'd learned. Kindness isn't just about helping someone else, he said, his voice gaining strength. It's about creating something bigger than yourself. When someone shows you kindness, you don't just keep it, you pass it on. You plant it, like a seed. And if you take care of it, it grows into something that can change the world. The room was silent for a moment after he finished, and then the applause came, thunderous and genuine. Dion stood there, overwhelmed but proud, as he realized that his story had resonated with people in ways he hadn't imagined. An unexpected encounter. After the event, as Dion stood in the corner sipping a cup of juice, a man approached him. He was tall, sharply dressed, and had an air of quiet authority. "Dion Daniels," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Marcus Reed. I run a nonprofit that helps young people like you find opportunities to grow and lead. I was impressed by your speech." Dion shook his hand, feeling slightly intimidated. "Thank you, sir." Marcus smiled. "I'd like to offer you a spot in our mentorship program. We pair promising young leaders with mentors in their chosen fields. It's a chance to learn, grow, and make an even bigger impact." Dion's eyes widened. "Really? You think I could do that?" Marcus nodded. "Absolutely. You've already proven you have what it takes. This program will just give you the tools to go further." Dion felt a swell of excitement and fear. "I'd need to talk to my mom," he said. "Of course," Marcus replied, handing him a business card. "Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around every day." The decision. That night, Dion sat at the kitchen table with his mom, the card in his hand. He explained what Marcus had offered, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. His mom listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It's a big commitment," she said when he finished. "But it sounds like a good one. What do you think, Dion?" Dion hesitated. I want to do it, but I don't want to leave you and the boys." His mom smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We'll be fine. You've done so much for this family already. This is your chance to do something for yourself and for the future." Dian nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Okay, I'll do it." The journey ahead. The mentorship program became a turning point for Dian. He met mentors who taught him about leadership, community building, and the power of perseverance. He learned how to navigate the challenges of his neighborhood while dreaming of a bigger future. And through it all, he never forgot the lessons of kindness and responsibility that had brought him there. Back in his neighborhood, Dian continued to give back, planting seeds of hope and growth wherever he could. His mom became a leader in the community, organizing programs that lifted others up. Together, they turned the Hargraves gift into something far greater than money. They turned it into a legacy. Years later, as Dian stood in front of a crowd at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community center he had helped establish, he thought back to that first encounter with Mr. Hargrave. A simple act of kindness had set everything in motion, proving that even the smallest gestures could ripple out into something extraordinary. Dian smiled, holding the scissors steady as he cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged, not just in his neighborhood, but in the world. And he knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning.